Good evening. Welcome to the open microphone session of the annual meeting of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. This session will be over Cuba's economic policy options in response to the current crisis. And it will deal with both the outlook, the economic outlook, and possible policy responses. And we are going to try to concentrate on this area, on the economic outlook and policy. We have another open mic session tomorrow night over U.S. policy, but here we will be dealing with Cuban policy. And we are going to have two eminent experts on the Cuban economy and economic policy. Pavel Vidal and Lorenzo Perez, who are going to make brief introductory comments of about 5 minutes. After that, we will open the microphone to attendees that can make statements of 3 minutes each. So to start, we will have Pavel Vidal, who is a professor of economics at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Cali, and who has written extensively on the Cuban economy and has also at one point being an economist at the Central Bank of Cuba, and has been a visiting professor at many institutions of higher learning in Latin America, the US, and Europe. Pavel.
Okay, well, good night, no? This is a strange time, but I think it's a good idea. It was a good idea to prepare this open mic session, no? As a follow-up to the previous panels, no? I think that we had two excellent panels, one in the morning, talking about the economic and political challenges from Jorge, Carmelo, and Everleni. This is clear a very gloomy and depressing scenario. This is a full-blown crisis. It has all the components that we teach our students as a full-blown crisis. We have the balance of payments constraints, as was explained in the afternoon for Gabriel. This is a accumulation of external shocks, starting with the impact of the Venezuelan crisis, the escalation of the US economic sanctions, and the decision of the Cuban government to put on hold the structural economic reforms. Omar Everleni mentioned an important topic, which is the policy sequences, because I don't want to blame the monetary reform, but for all of the instability that are going on in Cuba this year. But we know that there was a better moment, a better time to undertake this sizable devaluation of the exchange rate, maybe in the early 2000, 2004, 2005, when the Cuban economy was receiving the windfall from the trade with Venezuela, or maybe in the second period of the Obama administration, in this period of rapprochement within the two countries, when we see this high rate of growth in tourism. But the government decided to go ahead this year, and this is going to add more instability. But I agree with Everleni. This is important for the years to come. And I think that the policy response, going to the main point of this session, after the July 11 events or protests, I will divide it in two groups of measures. I think that there are a few measures that are important for some families. It's a relief for some families, like bringing or importing foods, medicine, tax-free, the garage sales, and so on. But they are not very important for the economy as a whole. But there is a different group of policy decisions with a more structural character, like this new opening to the private sector, to non-agricultural cooperative. The decision that has been, I think that nobody mentioned that, the decision to eliminate the price cap on agricultural markets. I think that this is a very important. Hopefully, this is going to be a permanent decision for the functioning of the agricultural market in Cuba. And I will include in this group of policies the monetary reform. And I disagree with Gabriel, because he said that he thinks that the relative price shock, that the exchange rate devaluation is not important. Maybe considering maybe on the logic of the connection between the exchange rate and the balance of payments, this correlation maybe is weak. But I think the relative price shock is very important, because that dual system was designed mostly to subsidize the state-owned enterprises. And that reality changed. This is a transparency shock. We know that the Cuban government is saying that 500 state-owned enterprises are running losses, and they have to make a decision about it. And this is a consequence of the exchange rate devaluation. And this is going to bring in it could bring in important transformation in the structure of the productive system in Cuba, and we can connect this to seemingly unrelated events, the exchange rate devaluation, with this new opening to the private sector, including the small and medium enterprises. But I think that there are important structural reforms that has been announced, but they are only, I think they are only gained traction some point next year. So we have these few reforms or measures that are unimportant for the whole economy. They are going to have a short-term impact. We have these structural reforms that are going to have a meaningful impact, but in a longer term. So this is going to lead me to say, I want to finish saying this, that this second half of the year is going to be very critical. And I think that I do not exaggerate if I say that the Cuban economy, at least in this second half of the year, is going to be heading into a near humanitarian crisis. And it's not something that a conclusion that I get from the data, but only also for the anecdotal information, but important, that we are receiving from relatives and friends in Cuba. So I think that there are many, not many, but there are some important reforms that the Cuban government is implemented, but I don't think that the Cuban government has at this point resources or policy space to mitigate or to avoid the deterioration of the economic and social situation in the second half of this year. And I think that it's important to see how the Cuban government and the economy as a whole is going to navigate this critical period in the second half of this year. So I better leave it there, and welcome to participate in the debate.
Thank you, Pavel. This is a concise and very clear introduction. And now we have Lorenzo Perez Monetaries. Lorenzo is well known to all of us as ASCE. He was at the International Monetary Fund for most of his career, where he was involved in stabilization programs and different analysis all over the world. He was, I remember, head of the Brazilian negotiations during one of the Brazilian debt crises, and he was in one of the Middle East divisions at one point, and I believe also in the exchange relations uh, department at some point, but maybe I do not remember. It's a long career, and he has evaluated many IMF programs over the years and participated in the design of them. And is also a keen analyst of the Cuban economy. So we are looking forward to your insights, Lorenzo.
Thank you, and thank you to ASCII for this invitation. I wanted to divide my presentation in two parts. One, summarize quickly what we hear, most of it this morning, what led to the current situation, to the current crisis. And in terms of order, I think that the economic system in Cuba, the reliance on central planning, the, the directions in the economy decisions by the government officials, this has been really a disaster in terms of economic development for Cuba. Right now in Cuba, Pavel made reference to the dire situation. There's a scarcity of goods and services. There is hunger for the first time after the Cuban Revolution, I think, in Cuba. So this economic system, to me, is the first cause of the situation that we have. The liberalization measures that were announced by Raúl Castro 5, 6 years ago, they were only half implemented. And I agree with Pavel and Everleni that then when they took the decision to devalue the peso, that's really what they did, they didn't have the secondary conditions to get the benefits. There's a tremendous problem of lack of external finance. Cuba has defaulted twice at least with Paris Club creditors that refinance the debt of Cuba in favor of terms. Venezuela's situation doesn't allow Venezuela to continue to subsidize Cuba, although oil export prices have increased. The private capital markets are closed to Cuba. There's no possibility of borrowing from banks or other financial institutions. And China and Russia, as Carmelo Mesalao explained this morning, have reduced their help. Then you have the measures taken by the Trump administration to restrict remittances and restrict American tourism to Cuba that also have been a hit in the economy. And the ordenamiento monetario, the so-called ordenamiento monetario, yes, resulted in the necessary devaluation that was needed, but you still have two currencies, as it was explained this afternoon, two or three currencies, and there was no possibility of having the favor supply responses that one looks in such a large devaluation. And finally, COVID hit. COVID essentially closed tourist sectors. My contacts in Cuba tell me that the only tourists arriving right now are from Russia. There's a black market in Russia to buy permits that you were vaccinated. And when the Russians arrive, they have some of them come with the COVID. But right now, the tourist sector is pretty much closed. It's unlikely to open on time for the tourist season in the winter. So this is the situation that we are facing in Cuba. I think there are three issues to me very important, and I have more urgency than Pavel. I think, yes, I agree that the second half of this year is a very serious situation, but I think that if Cuba is going to start getting out of this mess, they have to do a couple of very important things. The first thing is, yes, I know that they are issuing decrees for small enterprises, allowing them, giving them some legal position in the economy, and for the cooperative, the non-farm cooperative. But this is too modest, too little, and too late. I think they really have to liberalize the private sector activities, beginning with allowing every Cuban who work wherever he wants to work. If you are a professional, an architect, an engineer, a physician, you can do some private activity, and that will generate a tremendous positive impact on the economy. Just think, for example, if there is a Guajiro that is able to get a good crop of, or what shall I say, aguacates, that he can go and find a carretillero and he sells the aguacates to the carretillero, and the carretillero goes to La Habana or Santa Clara and sells the aguacates. That at various times has been not has been prohibited. So we need to get this the private sector in Cuba, who are many. There are many activities on the ground in Cuba that could come to the front, like rebuilding, help reconstruction in various houses, that sort of thing. If it gets out of the underground economy, will be a major boost for the economy. Also, get the state out of the role of financing and imports. Let the private sector in Cuba import. Let the private sector find financing. They might have a cousin in Miami who's willing to give them some money to start a business. Let that happen openly. It's happening to some extent already, but openly. The measures which are very popular are allowing people to go with 7 suitcases is something that in the short run helps a lot. But I call those Tibirichi measures. I don't know if you guys remember the word Tibirichi. Tibirichi is a small place that people sell like in the corner in the old times. There was a Tibirichi, you buy some cigarettes, you buy one cigarette. Well, these measures are Tibirichi. We need more fundamental measures to get Cuba out of the crisis. So privatization, allow private sector, allow the imports, allow them to obtain foreign financing. Really liberalize foreign direct investment. If somebody wants to invest in Cuba, make it easier. Don't come up with sectors where the government believes these are the key sectors where you can invest. They have a terrible experience with that, very poor performance. So let the Cuban Americans invest in Cuba. That's the easiest thing to get money into the economy. So that's the first part, is supply measures to increase the availability of goods and services. The government needs a great need of foreign financing for the government to help finance the public sector deficit, to reestablish a safety net that has been broken down, to provide a basic service to the Cuban people. And the only source of financing that the Cuban government can find these days is, and this is an anuncio político pagado, is asking for joining the IMF, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. That will take some time, but I'm sure that this organization will be more than happy to entertain the admission of Cuba, and that will provide financing and technical assistance. You don't need the vote of the United States to enter the IMF. It's a simple majority vote, and the U.S. does not have veto power on that. In fact, I'm pretty sure the U.S. administration, the current one, will be happy to have Cuba taking that step. It's an important step. You have to open your books. You have to discuss your economic policy or the lack of economic policies, but that's something that will help Cuba tremendously. There's also a need to turn around and approach the United States. I think if the Cuban government seriously asks for negotiations with the U.S. government, the U.S. government will respond. It will be difficult. They can discuss the lifting of the embargo, but all those things will really go also of bringing Cuba into the 21st century. That was done in Europe 30 years ago. It can be done in Cuba. And finally, the other big part of this thing, I think, is once you have these reforms taking place, you can aspire to have a real foreign exchange market in Cuba, where there are not measures taken like prohibiting the deposit of dollars in the banks. You can have the sources of new foreign exchange feeding into a foreign exchange market where the exchange rate will be determined by market forces, and the exchange rate can play the useful role that it plays in allocating resources. Now, you might say, well, Lorenzo, you are dreaming, you are delusional. Yes, probably that might be the case, but I wanted to really speak and say what is really needed to get going. The alternative of going very slow or not doing most of these measures is that there could be a continuous stagnation of economic activity and pain for the Cuban people. So let me stop here and hear others' comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for these very interesting comments. And now we can open the microphone to participants. And please, you may make a statement and just make sure you stick to about 3 minutes. I think Roger Betancourt raised his hand. Maybe we can have Roger make a statement.
Okay, Roger.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, the two sessions this morning were excellent and they lay down very clearly what the current situation was. And in a more descriptive fashion in the morning and a more interpreted fashion in the afternoon. I would say that as macroeconomists, there was one thing that they did, which is typical of macroeconomists, which is fine. That's what they get paid to do. But normally, they tend to ignore political economy factors and distributional factors and distribution of power. And that came out in several of the discussions. I would also like to tie that up to both what Pavel Vidal said and what Lorenzo said. And I think that one of the things that's been missing, because it's a lot harder to articulate, is the fact that all of these reforms and attempts to reforms have consequences for people in power and their ability to hold power. And one of the things that happened after de-dollarization was the introduction of the coup, and that could also be viewed as a mechanism for the government to be able to empower people who were politically powerful but economically not so powerful as a result of dollarization to have access to dollars. And that worked for a while, but it became less and less effective as time went on. And the points that were made today about the fact that the system now is very similar to the system before is true, but there is some big changes. One change is that the people that are subsidized now are different than the ones that were subsidized before. And we don't seem to have too much of a handle on that. And we don't think that maybe it doesn't matter, but maybe it does matter. And another thing that was pointed out, particularly through Jorge Dominguez's presentation, is that there has been a reorganization of the people in power as a result of the political changes in the structure of the political system with respect to the demographic representation of different groups and the numbers and the role of the military. And so my perception of what these situational factors have been since the special period is that a lot of the economic measures are really driven by these power issues, but they are not explicitly discussed as such because it's not so, and also because we don't have enough information to do so. And so I think that I agree with both Lorenzo and Pavel that there's going to be a humanitarian crisis. I've been doing a lot of research independently of Cuba on the COVID-19, and Cuba is one of the 40 countries that have been following doing that, and it had a very unique strategy that you can characterize as a gamble with respect to COVID-19, and that gamble has led to a catastrophe that in some areas, the medical system that is one of the little jewels they tried to sell has imploded. Ciego de Ávila is one. I just got an email detailing how things are totally out of control and they're trying to establish control. Even the government doesn't have control. Like Jorge Dominguez was saying, well, Cuba shouldn't be described as a failed state. In some ways, he's right. I think, but Cuba can be described as having lost a lot of state capacity in that area. The way they describe what was happening in these hospitals is outrageous. They had no control of who was going in and out of the hospital. They had no control of the medicines that were going in and out of the hospital. So I think that there is a serious situation and we need to pay a little bit more attention to how those in power are trying to use this situation to survive and not lose track of that by just looking at the economic side, which is what economists like to do, but basically politics and power struggles tend to drive a lot of what happens everywhere. And in that sense, Cuba is no exception, but Cuba is somewhat unique in the sense that there is too much power concentrated in too few hands compared to most other countries. I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Roger. Now, who wants to make a comment? Let's see, the two participants have raised their hands.
We've got Jose Gabilondo.
All right, so, okay, when we have Jose speak, please.
Oh, great. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm sorry I missed the first presentation. I'm going to watch it on tape. First, an observation. It seems to me that in Cuba, the economists are much more independent and economically progressive than the lawyers. I'm curious if others think that. And by that, I mean, the economists, they think structurally. And in Cuba, progressive means open and interested in market economics. That's how I define it. The economists, they do seem to think and express independent conclusions, but I can't think of lawyers who do that. And so I just wondered if others think that's true. And specifically, I'm curious in what folks think about the performance of Marino Murillo Jorge, because I'm very impressed by what he's done. And I think there's been a real change before and after June 11th. But if you look at his interventions on Mesa Redonda and on Twitter from last December through June, what I found very interesting is that he was really focused on internal factors. He didn't blame capitalism, neoliberalism, or the United States. It really felt like someone who was focused, like in the Reinhold Niebuhr Serenity Prayer, on what are the things that we can control. Now, after June 11th, there's been a huge change, and the discourse has changed. but he seems to me like a technocrat, and and it seems to me like he's more than knowledgeable about market economics. He often seems very sympathetic to market forces, and so others have probably more experience with him, and so I just wanted to say that he, I seem, I'm impressed by him, but I'm curious about what other folks might think. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. And we had another participant that raised his hand. Felipe Mantega. Yes, Felipe.
Buenas noches. Por lo menos aquí en la Florida de noche ya. So can you hear me?
Yes.
And
Yes.
hi, everybody. First of all, I want to tell Lorenzo, we delusionals salute you, because we have been delusional for a long time. So thank you so much. Then Pavel mentioned something that seems to capture everything I have heard so far. Very profound, very quick. Too little, too modest, too late. We economists are not used to that, especially when we are called after it is too little, too late, and we are asked to fix what's going on. Here, I would like to see how we can look to the future based not on projecting what a bankrupt government is doing or is projecting to do, but how could we modify the trends that are happening right now? And I am not being delusional. I have seen this done in other countries, but takes time. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Let's see, has anyone else?
Renee Costales.
Renee, yes. Renee Costales.
Okay. I very much agree with Lorenzo's guarded optimism. Even though many measures have been made by the Cuban government in a very belated fashion. And I want to revisit two of them. One of them was the new ability, or the more recent ability of selling real estate. There used to be a very, very, very complicated process, still very complicated, but it's not as horrendous as it used to be. They liberalized the sale of real estate. And, again, the market works. And there, one of the good reasons they did that is if they, maybe by chance, they learned from the experience of Berlin. When East Germany fell, Berlin immediately organized the system to sell real estate and to provide clear title. And in 6 months, 90-some% of the real estate properties in East Berlin were sold. And the price per square meter rose up to the 3 months and then stabilized, which meant that a lot of people lost money that they could have otherwise sold had they had a stable market before. Okay, so learning from that lesson, they went ahead in Cuba, I think, and liberalized that market. They liberalized the market also to sell automobiles. Okay? And it's, it's more or less a freer market now than it used to be. But there are a lot of things. Finally, they seem to be able to approve now. Finally, the cooperatives in the agricultural area and non-agricultural cooperatives, and amazing. That took a long time. That should have been approved 5 or 7 years ago. It's incredible to try to understand why that wasn't approved, but apparently it's now coming in. Now, I'll go a little farther than Lorenzo, and I'll propose that one of the first things that they need to do now, particularly when the subsidies for the state enterprises that used to import at the lower exchange rate and all those hidden subsidies, is that they have to start thinking of privatizing. Maybe you want to call it something else. You want to call it the transfers to the non-private, non-government sector, or they want to call it whatever they want to call it, but it still will be another privatization. They have to start doing that. Why, if they, once they decided to have tourism, they decided to have management contracts with foreign hotel operators like Meliá and all of the others, you know, because they needed them. They needed them for the tourist market, and they needed them. Now they also need agreements, whether it's complete privatization, sale, management contract, and so on, to take over all of these bankrupt enterprises that have been subsidized for years and years, and learn to be creative in those privatization contracts by requesting additional financing and additional investment from those industrial groups, whether it's the soap factory, whether it's, you know, you name it, you know, you need to start, you know, Cuba needs to start privatizing all those unprofitable enterprises. And that would be one of the, you know, the prime types of projects that World Bank and IDB can help and has helped other countries in the region process their privatization schemes, like I helped in Panama at one time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rene. And let's see, do we have another?
David Ley Herrera.
Yes, please.
Hold on.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for the beautiful presentation in the morning and in the afternoon. That were amazing. It's good to see you back.
Oh, sorry, David. Sorry. There we go. Sorry. I'm sorry. Could you start again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
That was my bad. Sorry.
It's okay, no worries. Thank you everyone to be here on another meeting of ASCE. And thank you for the amazing presentation in the morning and in the afternoon. And I would like to see, I have been involved on, well, I went to Calle Ocean in July 11. I have been following really close all what is happening in Cuba and here in Miami. And it calls my attention that July 11 might set a precedent on the Cuban government that they only move when they are under heavy pressure. Why do I say that? So in the morning presentation, everyone said that this was not a good time to make an exchange rate reform, even though they did it. Why did they did it? Because they were under pressure. Now they eliminate the price cap. We have been listening to that since I was a student in 2003, and Omar Berlenis and Pavel Vidal were my professors. Why do they do it now? Because they were under pressure. Now, there is a big debate about the 500 state company business that are running on losses. I always tell some people say you need to shut down those other companies. I would say give it to the private sector. Give it to the private sector to make it work, to see what they do. It's not your responsibility. And that is the reason what I believe that July 11 set a precedent. I don't know if it's a precedent or no, but like a Cuban government only move when it is under pressure, and what can we do in the future to avoid that? Thank you.
Thank you, David. Anyone else raising his hand?
I don't know if Felipe or Renee are looking to speak again, but Gary has his hand raised too. Should I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead, Gary.
Okay, I just have some disjointed observations. A little bit like Cuban policy, disjointed, so am I. First, Armando Nova, colleague of many of our Cuban economists, has just done a very interesting paper, which I'm sorry I wasn't ready for the conference, but we will put in happenings coming out next month. He makes an interesting observation of several to it, that a lot of the regulations and a lot of the things that get in the way of, particularly in agriculture, come not from a federal level, but from a state and municipal level. I remember correctly back at the time of the Constitution, and maybe before that, when they listed all they reorganized who did regulations and transferred them up down to the state, to the municipality and the provinces. They gave a lot of power. And he's arguing in his paper that in fact, that's still a major source of problems, that municipalities can arrange prices and so on. It'll be interesting to see what, if anything, they've done about that. To David Lay's point about under pressure, that's something you might want to bring up tomorrow night in the foreign policy group. Because there's a lot of talk of liberalizing the U.S., liberalizing the U.S. The noise in the background is my granddaughter, by the way. And some of us have long believed that once you start liberalizing the embargo, the result is just the opposite of what you hope. The perfect example being Obama's policy, which had some strong political reasons for doing what he did, but clearly did not work in terms of economic reform. And then finally, a point I tried to make today, maybe not as articulately as I would have liked, is it just seems to me that there's a tremendous potential for the Cuban exile community to provide a tremendous amount of capital to Cuba. But if they're going to do that, there's got to be a capital market. There's got to be a way for the entrepreneurs to import what they need. I have a friend who's a baker. He could use some new equipment. Farm. The government has a great deal of time getting seeds and fertilizer on time. Be nice if farmers, if they can't get it from the government on time, could do it and order it themselves. In Central America, supplier credits were very important to the markets. And when the Sandinistas in Nicaragua closed or nationalized all the imports and exports of agricultural products and imports of intermediate goods, credit dried up. It took me a long time to figure out what was going on. The banks claim they're getting more credit than ever. But what it turned out is your shells and your companies that provided the fertilizer and seeds had been providing a lot of the credit, and when they were pushed out of the market, that credit disappeared. So opening that up to something would be a major importance. There's a lot of things they could do, and I think some of it would act pretty quickly if they could do it. But will they is another question. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gary. Anyone has raised his hand?
I'm happy to speak a little bit about this. if you're willing to spend 2 minutes.
Oh, go ahead, Larry.
All right. The conversations have been very interesting, and for me, they tend to illustrate the impasse that Cuba, Cubanists, and the situation both within the Cuba and around it now finds itself. We are, I think, at the point where decisions must be made, but in a context in which decisions are impossible to be made precisely because any kind of decision would require one side or another to give up preciously held either habits, advantages, or ideological positions that are deeply held, whether meaningfully or not. And in a sense, I don't want to use the word gamesmanship, but the ideological constraints that produce this kind of circular variation in the production of what appears to be reform in Cuba, and the equally circular responses from those outside of Cuba, each hoping for and grounded in very, very different endgames, produce a situation that in its current context is absolutely impossible of resolution, because there is a tremendously high risk of loss for moving from one's position, where the other actors within this complex interplay do not, and a prospect of very little reward. And given this, plus the difficulty of communicating across ideology, it becomes both difficult and at the same time easy to continue to have the sorts of discussions that we've been having in one form or another through a variety of crises, certainly since the late 80s. And in a way, if we would be able to layer the discourse of crisis and the need for reform and kind of play them simultaneously, late 80s, mid 90s, mid first decade of the 21st century, during the recession, the crisis at the end of Fidel's effective tenure, and now, I think we would find a horrifying similarity in both the positions of all of the actors and the ultimate impossibility of resolution, other than to make movements that appear to move in particular directions, but that actually in the long term are meaningless in the sense that they actually move any of the parties to different positions. And at the core of this, and I'll end with this, at the core of this is actually the fundamental problem, and that is the problem of the markets. The core of a critically important faction within the Cuban government and party absolutely positively remain suspicious of the market and anything that looks like it. All of the people around them, including people in Cuba and people outside of Cuba, are far less suspicious of the market. And when one begins to talk about reform, and one talks either about markets or about reforming central planning models, one gets to the point where people will almost inevitably, as they continue to do today, talk over each other to the point that we may be able to hear each other, but it is unlikely that we will be able to listen effectively, other than to listen just enough so that we can avoid the ultimate crisis that will generate chaos. And I'll end with that.
No, thank you, Larry. Let's see, any follow-up? Any comments?
Oh, good. That got some juices
I'll
flowing.
make it just a quick follow-up. Well, I mean, listening to Roger and listening to Larry, and they come up to this relationship to power. And I'm not a political scientist, but yes, I mean, there's a fear of reform, the fear of markets. And the question is, where is the Cuban Gorbachev? And I remember a Russian expert many, many years ago told me the story of Gorbachev going to the Politburo. Gorbachev was Minister of Agriculture, and they asked him, what the hell is the problem? You know, we cannot feed our people. And what's the problem? And Gorbachev said, 1917. And there came the thing. And it looks like the calculation the people in power make is an unusual calculation, because we know that there are many, many reforms that will benefit the people if they are taken, but they present a risk to the people in power, and it's difficult to overcome that. And I think it's difficult to, and I'm not a scientist of government, but it seems to be difficult to be overcome by committees. And my sense is that in the places where there is the biggest fear, and I can think of two, and North Korea and Cuba, where the people in power has tremendous fear of reform. And I think, I don't know what the solution is, but I think the question of power relations is very important, of why reforms do not accelerate. Now, the question of the mechanics of it, whether the sequencing is this or that or the other, there's been a huge debate in economics about the sequencing of reforms. And as far as I can tell, these debates are always very difficult, because there is no ideal sequencing. The answer is what my friend Ernesto Hernandez-Cata always says, is that you have to go ahead at full speed, because any delay essentially gives ammunition to the people who oppose reforms. And I think that's a wise observation, and that comes from the reforms in Eastern Europe, that it was found that the way to go is essentially you have to have a big bang. And I think that Cuba has not reached that point, and I do not see what the mechanics of it are in terms of power, but we will be likely surprised. And I better stop, because this is not really my area.
Well, let me say something about that. Like Larry, I have argued for years that the political and economic, bureaucratic, ideological forces in Cuba were such that made reform virtually impossible. I wrote a paper, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago about the arteriosclerosis of the political process in Cuba. I am seeing a change, and I cannot quote you. I'm too busy getting a conference ready to sort of sit down and pull things out. I'm seeing a bit of a change. I'm seeing a greater recognition of market forces, and in the comments of the leaders. I say it's still very confused, but I think they're moving away from the ideology, which is really as much as, not so much Marxist as Fidel's. They've got a problem in the Eighth Party Congress. One of the key comments I thought was by Raul, who argued that you know, the private sector cannot be allowed to commercialize. That is to sell retail. Yet I've seen indications of people talking about that might change. Don't know it yet. I can't quote it yet. But I'm hoping that we will all be very pleasantly surprised at some point in the medium term, if not the immediate term. So I'm going to go out and stick myself out on a limb and say, I'm still expecting some change in that. And this time next year, you can all put me up against the post and pillar me to death if you want. Thank you.
Yeah, let me say something too. I know what Roger is saying, what Larry just said, and Luis. I mean, obviously there are vested interests in any government, and those vested interests want to protect their interests, and it's difficult to do it. But my recommendation, my suggestion that negotiations start with the multilateral negotiation. You know, the multilateral negotiations have met with many governments that have vested interests. And, you know, sometimes you have to go very slow, sometimes you can go faster, but things can happen. It has been a very long time, decades, that the US government and the Cuban government have sat down seriously to discuss their differences. Many decades. One thing that is happening is generations are dying, you know, on both sides of the Florida Strait. So, you know, my parents' generation is pretty much gone, and I'm entering in a generation that's going to be going soon too. So they're new people, you know, and why not try it? Hmm?
I think, if I may just interject, one of the problems is that the US should not get too far out in front on reforms, because it generates an immediate negative reaction on the part of the Cuban government. You know, we make moves sort of to try to improve relations with Cuba, as did Obama. But then we have this need back home to have to justify it. And we always attempt to justify it as how it's going to change the government, which of course is totally counterproductive to the audience we want to really need to influence, which is the audience in Cuba. I've argued for a long time a policy of basically oh, I've lost my term, constructive engagement, where we not get too loud in our demands for this, our demands for that, but we tell the Cubans privately, and actually I think we have in some cases, that if they make changes, we will respond positively. And that's still, I think, my view. If they really open up the private sector, then I think we should get rid of the embargo, at least in the private sector. And I think we should open up to allow supply of credits, as long as they don't come from, you know, federally insured deposits. But if we go and simply announce you've got to do this, you have to do that, I think it's just politically just creates a very negative reaction in the Cuban psyche.
Okay, thank you, Gary.
May I ask Pavel a question?
Yes. Go ahead, Larry.
Pavel, so here's my question, given what I've just said, and given what Gary has just said, the Cubans are probably, and rightly so, very sensitive about guidance from the Americans, because they would not be unreasonably wrong to worry that whatever drink the Americans offer them would be poison. Including the American version of markets. But Cubans have had an alternative, which I'm always surprised that they have never really begun embracing very much. And so my question to Pavel is, I realize that they had put a lot of their risk and their hopes in Venezuela. But the Belt and Road Initiative and this new union of developing states and Asian Marxist-Leninist states might have provided the Cubans with enough of a cover for them to move towards a kind of Marxist markets model that would suit them enough, but which would at least allow them to avoid the ideological issue while moving towards even managed markets. And yet, everything I've seen seems to indicate that the Cubans trust that camp almost as much as they trust the Americans. And I was wondering whether that is the case or whether something else is going on, because that would have been the obvious way of breaking the problem, at least the conceptual problems for Cuban Marxist intellectuals to then allow the economists, including Marxist economies, some substantial leeway to moving towards Lorenzo's position, which is not an unreasonable one.
Right. Well, I'm not also an expert in political economy, but I'm going to toss my ideas. No, so first I would like to say that I think that I am cautiously optimistic about the path of reforms. I mean, and I will connect this with obviously with July 11. This is clearly an event that is going to mark a tipping point. I cannot forget this video of Ramiro Valdez trying to establish a conversation and to replicate what Fidel Castro did in 1994. And it's clearly an evidence that this historic legitimacy is not working anymore. And I think that this new generation of political leaders, as Jorge mentioned, there's a new wave of younger leaders. We don't know exactly what is in their minds because they were carefully selected. But as we are aware, and it's so clear, so evidence that this model is not functional and is not delivering as expected, and that there is other alternative like Vietnam and China, the so-called socialism, market socialism. And even at some point, I think that Raúl Castro was trying to get a lesson from that model. And I think it could, that case could give them some leeway to advance in market reform with ideological justification by explaining that we are still a socialist economy and we are just advancing in market reforms. And I think that July 11 is adding more pressures to accelerate the reforms, and it's clear that they have to find a way to gain legitimacy by producing goods and services for ordinary Cuba. And it's clear that the market reform is the only way, because they have tried many other formulas. They are trying to reorganize the state sector. They're trying to many times to improve the bureaucratic socialism, but it didn't work. And as we are aware of that, as that is clear to us, I think for many of them is also crystal clear. And I would like also to add to the equation, one change that was introduced in the new constitution, saying that the president and the high rankings are not going, they only have 2 terms to complete the reforms. And there is some literature of the economic policy that when the elite feels that the power is temporary, they might behave in a different way. So this lack of legitimacy, the June 11 events, and this change in the constitution, and all these cumulative evidence about the failures of the system, and the clear evidence of what a country can get from market reforms, coming from the experiences of China and Vietnam. I think they are all variables of the one equation that could press for reform. I don't know the pace. I don't know when this is going to realize, but I think that this is clear. The direction is my comment. And in the way in which the U.S. can relate to that is difficult to tell. It's difficult to tell. Sometimes it's better not to intervene. That's always the best case. It's better to, if it's possible, to lift the economic sanctions, because if you want that the market reforms gain traction and gain popularity, you cannot gain results of market opening if you don't have, for example, the help of international lender of last resort, you don't have a normal access to international capital. So I think that we are going to have another open mic session tomorrow, talking about the influence of and how the U.S. could play in these dynamics.
Oh, thank you, Pavel.
Sergio Diaz Riquez has his hand up.
Sergio, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I wasn't really going to raise this issue, but you know, I'm learning a lot today, all 3 sessions. But the thing that came to mind is that in a way, everything we've been discussing is of for lack of a better word, of a global nature. But I'm thinking, and perhaps it's inevitable, but I'm thinking that ultimately the Cuban Revolution was built on a social contract. And there are clearly distributional questions that I do not know if in a situation of crisis could be addressed. But the fact, something that I've been harping at for quite a long time, Cuba really faces a major crisis. Right now, and in the short term, it's going to be far worse, which is an aging population very fast. We already know from some of the data shown today and that Carmelo has shown and so forth, that the elderly in particular are very, very vulnerable. So within this context of reform, is there any room to try to take care of the most vulnerable? I mean, I'm sure that Lorenzo and the IMF types that have been participating in economic restructurings, you know, next to in the Soviet Union and so forth, must have thought about these issues. But is there anything that you could add, that you could illuminate, or is that so far back in the burner that if it happens to benefit some of them, if not, let them eat cake? That's all.
Thank you, Sergio.
Let me answer that a little bit, because I kind of tried to get that in some questions earlier today. It seems to me that the Cuban government is really between a rock and a hard place. and it's a very hard rock and a very hard space. It's they really do need to address the needs of the elderly and the economically vulnerable. Yet we saw today, and I don't know, I think it was in Carmelo's presentation, that only 3% of the government's resources are now going to help the most needy. So 0.3%. I mean, that's unacceptable, and it's not acceptable from a humanitarian basis. It's unacceptable, I think, from a political stability basis. And of course, if you look at the vast majority of the population that doesn't get remittances, they're suffering hunger, they're suffering real problems. The government has got to provide food, and it's got to provide medical help, the COVID, to this population, which is why I think they are trying to husband all the foreign exchange for themselves. And yet, to do that, they cut off the productive sector from the imports and whatever the investment funds they need to produce. It's a terrible situation they're in. And even if they had the best economic minds possible, if they hired ASCE, I don't know if they could do it. Enough said.
Oh, thank you, Gary.
This is why I stress the need to find external financing for Cuba, because the safety net has been broken. These older people who are really suffering a decline in real pension levels. In fact, most of them, their family has left Cuba. This is another complication they have. They're there by themselves, many of these older people. So you need to put together quickly some sort of a program that addresses some of the basic needs of the low-income population. And the only way you can do that probably is obtaining some sort of financing from a multilateral institution. And this is another area that could explode down the road this year, you know.
Well, thank you, Lorenzo. I should add, yeah, I think this is correct that Cuba would have to look for some external finance, but also think about this. Cuba is a very small economy. The flows of capital to Cuba could be important if the adequate reforms are made. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think that going to the IMF and the World Bank will be very positive for Cuba. But I think that, not to be terribly imaginative, they could do a few things that could add a lot of capital flows, because these are ridiculous. I mean, Cuba, as several people mentioned, they have these direct foreign investment projects, but they are essentially what they are. They are really the appendices of the budgets, of the state company budgets. And what happens is they have all these restrictions. And then the risk of doing business in Cuba is very high. So I think what does a foreign investor need to calculate to invest in Cuba? And the thing is, the risk is very high. And well, to start with, there is a huge convertibility risk, and that, of course, is a short-term problem. But then there is the whole risk about regulation. And then you keep adding all these risks, and essentially they get peanuts on foreign investment. And yeah, of course, the embargo is a problem, and Title VI is a problem. But this is a very small economy, and it's amazing what some reforms could do to attract capital flows in Cuba. Of course, Cuba is essentially in default, has been in default one way or another since 1960. And that can be resolved. I mean, the Chinese were in default for 25 years. So that can be solved. But it's a question of why don't they have enough reform momentum in Cuba, which is it's difficult to understand from the logic of the economy. It can only be understood by the logic of essentially political science and government, because from a pure economic logic, it doesn't make any sense not to reform. And I will stop here. Yeah.
I don't know whether Carmelo is listening to the session, but one day I was talking to him about the pension system in Cuba, and he's an internationally known expert on Social Security all over Latin America. He has written extensively, and he told me one of my worst nightmares is that they call me to Cuba to fix the pension system. Because it's so underfinanced and so under the water that it's very difficult to come up with some proposals.
Let's see. Any follow-up comments? I just had one comment on Gary's comment, and yes, I mean the argument is that the government needs to catch all the foreign exchange possible, so they have the system of the MLC stores, and so they have very large markups, which are a tax, and essentially the argument is well, they need to do this so they can finance food imports for the population and the needy and so forth, and medicines and so forth. But what happens is it affects capital flows, it affects transfers, and they are essentially very suboptimal, because people then will go around it. Why would you send money to a relative when you're going to have to pay a very high tax? And essentially they try to send merchandise, or they go on the ground or whatever. And what this does is it reduces the flow. I mean, the data is very difficult to pinpoint because all these flows are not recorded, but it does reduce the flow of resources. But in the short term, the government captures the foreign exchange, so that if this system is changed, the government will be a loser in the short term. But in the medium and long term, it will be a winner, or the country will be a winner. And essentially here we have these relations between what may be of benefit to the government in the short term as to what will be better for the economy a little bit longer on. And I think I'll stop here. But any other comments? I think Gabilondo had some questions that I certainly don't know how to answer about some of the policymakers. I don't know if anyone has any comments. I certainly don't know enough about this.
He asked about Marino Murillo, huh?
Yes.
Yes, but okay, we don't know where he is, no? We don't know where he is. And we know that the exchange rate devaluation didn't go as expected. He made some forecast about the inflation rate for this year. He made the promise that the state workers are going to were going to be the winners of this exchange rate devaluation, because he was expecting that the rise in the state salary was going to be higher than the inflation rate. But I think that he downplayed the impact of this full-blown crisis, the impact on the inflation rate of the shortages of foods and medicines. And I think that he is going to stay there, because I would include Marino within the progressive. I think that he's one of the, is more clear about the important role of the markets and the private sector. I don't think that he is out of the game. I think that he is going to be underground for a while, but I think that he was the only one that they understood the whole strategy and the whole logic of the economic monetary reform. and they still have many objectives that they haven't get yet. No, they promise many things with the exchange rate devaluation. One of the unfulfilled objective is the unification of the exchange rates, the unification of the currencies. So I think that he made some mistakes, but he is going to be there to fix it. It's how I see it, no? And following up with the comment of about dollarization, yes, dollarization of some markets is a way to the government to get direct access to foreign exchange, but it's not the only way. I think that that's one of the mistakes that the Cuban government has been making, that they have this preference for dollarization. And I think it was a mistake to, as the central bank was, while the central bank was devaluating the exchange rate, they've been dollarizing the economy. And that gave like mixed signals to the economy. So we have to make the most of the devaluation, or we need to make the most of the dollarization. And I think it was a mistake to re-dollarize the economy. It was something that was counterproductive in terms of what you gain after an exchange rate devaluation. The dollarization reduced the impact of the exchange rate devaluation.
Thank you, Pavel. I think I agree with you that that this has reduced the impact of the devaluation, and as you have mentioned, there has been a very important real devaluation of real exchange rate, and through different policy. I wouldn't say necessarily errors, but policy. Well, I guess that's the way to say it. They have been diluted, and I think the dollarization is a problem now. Let's see, any events? We are almost at.
Just a question, Pavel. Just a question, Pavel. Does the government have its own bureaucracy? Central bank, Ministry of Finance, whatever. The people who can really give them good advice.
I think that we have our friends in the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy. We have good economists there. And I think that within the central bank, my own experience is that we, under the leadership of Francisco Soberón, who was the head of the central bank at that time, being a young economist at that time, I felt open to express my criteria, to express my opinion. And even I even being a young economist, I was able to participate in the first versions of the monetary unification strategy. It was very different from the one who was implemented, but I think that spirit is still there. And one thing is the discussion that we see in the Congress of the Communist Party, a quite different spirit and debates happens within these institutions. That's why the problem is about ideology and political economy. It's not about the technicians.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel. Yes. Let's see, any final comments?
I want to plug what Rene Costales has put out in the chat. He recommends the movie Dear Comrades. I have seen it myself. I'm going to see it again. It's a great movie. for people who are, this goes to Pavel's last comment, for people who are interested in at least the European Marxist mindset and its intransigence, even in the face of what appears to be unavoidable reality. It's a great movie to watch with perhaps some insights into certain actors that exist outside of Russia and outside of the late 50s and 60s. But anyway, thanks, Renee, for reminding us.
Yeah, we'll take note of it. And it's now 9 o'clock, and we are running the trains on time. And I have to thank all the participants, and especially Pavel and Lorenzo for their very clear introductions that set a good framework, and to ASCE for organizing this panel with an open microphone. Well, thank you very much, and we say goodbye.
Mañana.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches, gracias.